8th of February 2013.
All right, we got all the angels in the cloud are present. Yeah, let's find out. Hello, hello. How are you? So nice to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. Okay, welcome. Hi. I just say I want my class to be like the Apollo Theater. Yeah, Lindsay, go! Yay! I challenged myself all the way over here what part of this particular teaching I wanted to start with. And I still don't know. The point of these classes that I've been teaching called Notes from the Perimeter, the perimeter to me means the edge of my experience of trying to be the divine. Not even find the divine, trying to be the divine, which is a journey that I've taken since I was a small girl. And I wanted to ask myself the big questions, because as someone who has studied Buddhism for a while and someone who has been teaching Buddhism for a while, there's a certain point where you get to a kind of hypocrisy where you can't take it anymore. And you realize that you could sound very good. It's easy to sound very good. Bless you, Mark. It's easy to say these things. But then we go home and we find that we're having as much of a struggle as anybody else, maybe even more, because we're more focused on that struggle. So I'm going to start by speaking very personally. I was raised as a Christian. My father was a Methodist. He was a very devout person, very quietly, very transparently. He had read the Bible 4.5 times through by the time that he died in his 70s. And he walked his talk. And I had a mother who also was a churchgoer and who walked her talk. And both of them very, very clear about what their morality was, and clear with us growing up. I was confirmed in the church, which meant that I got relatively dressed up one day, not to the extent that the Catholics do, and I've always been disappointed. I see those beautiful little dresses and I go, damn, had to be a Protestant. Anyway, I was relatively dressed up. I was given a chance to give a speech. I know that I wrote the speech down, but I don't know where it is, and I have no idea what I said. But I think I must have said something about my own personal relationship with God, which I felt at a very young age. Again, I don't know why. I don't know why the questions of where I was going, who I was, and what would happen to me after I died were present in front of my mind, very young, but they were. I was given a copy of the King James Version of the Bible with my name on the front, the leather cover, at my confirmation, and I cherished the book and I read it often. I wrote in my Bible. I can see myself on my little single bed in my room in Massachusetts with my little, what would they call it, baby doll nightgown thing? Yeah, you know, like made out of nylon, like yellow nylon or something. And with my Bible in my hands and writing vehemently, like pressing really hard with my ballpoint pen into that very thin vellum paper with the gold edges. And I had great exclamation points after what I said. I was always in a kind of everlasting shouting match with the things that I was reading about. And I was deeply moved by the prophets of the Old Testament. I remember falling in love with Isaiah very clearly, and with the New Testament, the teachings of the New Testament. And I began to commune with God in nature. In the summer, when I lived in the country, every morning I would go to my window, which faced the east, where the sun was coming up over the woods, and I would press my nose against the screen to get as close to the outside air as possible. And I would take these deep breaths and smell the earth, what smelled like the good earth, which as a child raised in New York, I didn't have much contact with. I remember the books that you read in first grade, those, Dick and Jane books. Those kids they're always raking leaves. I never understood that. In New York, you didn't rake leaves. Something happened to the leaves other than raking. I don't know what. So the country to me was a truly divine place, extraordinary place in contrast. It was a kind of morning meditation, and I walked in the woods. That is a comment on the time that my parents let me walk in the woods at 7 years old, 8 years old. I frequented a spring that had been known to the Native Americans who had lived there. And I used to wade into a pond where there were water lilies just usually out of my reach. But I rigged up a pair of scissors that were very long so that I could pick them. And I would carry them home, whereupon they would immediately close up. But they were magical to me. And as I got older and my life became more complex, I found that I had come to expect of myself that I should behave in the ways that I thought God would want me to behave. And I discovered that I couldn't do that. And I became more and more disturbed by this. It became more and more troubling to me. When I was a single parent, I was so busy with the pressures of single motherhood that my connection to God, I told myself, was more mystical than practical. One proof in my life that I was still deeply searching for a closer sense of God was my library. Twice I had to clear out the library as the books were piling up. And both times, as I was handling the books, I realized that all of them were basically things like self-help books, ways that I was asking myself still the big questions of who was I? What was I meant to be doing? And who was I in relation to? When I began to study Buddhism, I studied the concept that the world is coming from me. And we've talked about this the last few weeks, that even if you just take it from the idea that you're born into a context, into a family and a culture, a particular form of education, religion, you have likes and dislikes that are even taught to you before you even know what you like or dislike. And that as you move through the world, basically you're placing your filter, my family, my beliefs, my likes, my dislikes, my culture, what my mom said, what my teacher said, on everything before you can even have a real experience of that. So they say in Buddhism that you are forced to see things the way you see them. There isn't an objective world out there apart from your perceiving of it. So that the reason why you're forced, and this is very logical, this makes sense, is by the way that you've thought and spoken and acted in the past. Of course that's who you are. That would inform you constantly. It informs us constantly how we're thinking, that we're not thinking like someone else, that I'm not thinking like a pygmy in the forest, that I'm not thinking like someone who lives and grows up in Japan, that I'm not acting in the ways that those people of those cultures behave, and therefore I am going to experience completely differently, even on account of the language that I speak. So this made sense to me, that I am creating my world. The radical element of it was that I'm not interpreting something that is kind of like a stencil out there. There's this basic world out there that I'm bumping into and interpreting. But in fact, I'm actually creating it. In the first Christmas, after I was studying Buddhism, I felt a great attachment, kind of poignant, tender attachment to the image of the crush of the Christ child. in the manger. And I remembered that growing up, this was my first altar. My family allowed me to keep the little creche that we displayed at Christmas in my room on my mantelpiece, which was right across from my bed. And this was a place of great reverence and curiosity for me. I would move all the figures around. I would freshen the little hay that I made for the cow, and I would make sure that the angel was in a very powerful position on the roof without falling off. I identified with the angel because I thought that all angels were girls. I have since been corrected, but I have yet to actually update that in my own mind. I think that I couldn't see myself as the Christ. I couldn't see myself raising the dead or volunteering for crucifixion to, redeem the sins of the world. But I could see myself flying around and blessing everything and looking quite pretty in a lovely robe with long flowing hair and unfolding banners and proclaiming important happy announcements. Angels appeared to me as maternal, brave, and joyful, and I felt that I possessed those qualities. And I think in a way that's where the line was drawn, that we cannot think God is made of us until we are made of God. We cannot think that God is made of us until we are made of God. That we have to be very honest with ourselves about what we think of ourselves. And I think this is where we have to dig very, very deeply in order to be on a spiritual path, no matter how much we're taught, no matter how many years we study. If we are denigrating ourselves, if we find that we are simply spending our days kind of in what they call Brownian movement in science, where the amoebas just kind of bump up against each other and wend their way that way, that we really live in a kind of half-consciousness, aware of all the noise and conflict and difficulty and busyness of the world. And we're not anywhere. We're not really here. We're not really in our bodies. We're not really in the world. And we kind of, I think, are comforted by that vague semi-existence. And every once in a while, something gets through, and I think we experience a great regret that we have been spending our days that way, and we get a sudden shock that perhaps there won't be that many days in the future to spend that way. And we sit down and really begin to think through why are we here? What are we doing? So this idea that my universe was being created by me, and this feeling that if I couldn't find myself in God, how could I find God in myself? I began to get at least an understanding that every awakening, as they call it in most religions, coming awake, really leaving behind that vague sense of hardly existing, half existing, that every awakening is a highly personal one, in that you're becoming enlightened in your own way, in your own time, no matter how many teachers are pulling on you with their very elegant leash. And that you're going to enter the forest where there is no path, or by definition, it's someone else's enlightenment. This Eastern idea that you are the creator is so extraordinary that I felt, even in the very early days of studying Buddhism, that I had to honor this idea by really taking it seriously and truly considering the possibility that it was true. We can assume it when we hear it, that the extraordinary is ours, that God is us, that everywhere we turn is sanctified. We can make an assumption the way they make an assumption in math. But I remember very well my wonderful math teacher, Mrs. Calhoun, who used to say to us, let us assume. And at that point, I was gone. She lost me completely. I thought, well, if we're assuming, you know, then why even have the discussion? What's that based on? What's the assumption based on out of which we're now going to fly off into mathematical theory? You know, that's like an illusion on top of an illusion. So I decided that I was going to start really at rock bottom level, asking myself things like, how have I been brought up? What is this karmic history that I'm carrying? I've been brought up in a big city. I grew up in New York. I had lots of education, really the top education that this country can offer. I went to Harvard. We are swimming in technology. God help us. We have lost our identification with what is deep and mysterious and good. For the most part, I would like to say that. We're identifying with what we're seeing, with the teeming, brawling centers of overwhelming stimulation and suffering, or in our suburbs with this sterile landscape of keeping things safe, where each man's house is protected by a gate, and there's an alarm system, usually always on, whether we're there or not. A little city-state in which there resides as much fear as with any man who felt compelled to build himself a castle. So where is this sanctification of the local landscape? I began to study some things about this. Aside from my own feeling when I was in touch with nature, as I described as a young person, I sensed from all of that it was there, that it was possible. But I also felt that I wasn't somehow, it wasn't with me all the time. Where did it go? Where did I go? So I began to read things about the Native Americans, and the Navajo used to identify where they lived: a northern mountain, a southern mountain, an eastern mountain, a western mountain, and a central mountain. In the Navajo Hogan, in their house, the door always faced east. The fireplace was at the center, which became a cosmic center. And when the smoke came up through the hole in the ceiling, the scent of the incense goes to the nostril of the gods. The landscape, the dwelling place, becomes an icon and a holy picture. Whatever you are related to the cosmic order. When you see a Navajo sand painting, there will be a surrounding figure, whether it represents a rainbow or a mirage. There will always be a surrounding figure with an opening in the east where the new spirit can come in. When Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree, he faced east, the direction of the rising sun. When I was in college in the spring, I used to drive from Harvard, from Boston out to Gloucester, Massachusetts, where my family had a home. We lived in the only house on the old Boston Post Road, historic road, which had a wonderful rocky dirt path, wide path still that went through the woods. And I would go for a wonderful run in the early spring. On that dirt road, which was hung over, the canopy of leaves would meet each other across the top of the road, and they would be turning that marvelous yellow-green of early spring. And there would be skunk cabbage, and there would be little vernal pools. There would be fiddlehead ferns unfolding and wintergreen returning, shafts of golden light that broke through the foliage, and a rich scent again of the earth, of humus, of the fallen trees that were breaking down and offering themselves to the new growth. And this, for me, was true magic. I would come to the end of the run, and I would lean up against a huge tree at the end of the road with a carpet of thick moss surrounding it. And I would bend over, and I would cry. I would be racked with sobs and breathing hard and be a total mess, just rejoicing in the sheer beauty of the day. This was a powerful experience of grace, and I wanted to stay and stay. And I would leave that place with a prayer and a deep, deep longing that I could find that grace again and ultimately become it. Joseph Campbell writes, "Going into the forest as a little boy, I can remember worshiping a tree, a great big old tree, thinking, my, what you've known and seen. I think this sense of the presence of creation is a basic mood of man. But now we live in a city, it's all stone and rock manufactured by human hands. It's a different kind of world to grow up in when you're out in the forest with the little chipmunks and the great owls. All these things are around you as presences, representing forces and powers and magical possibilities of life that are not yours and yet are all a part of life. And that opens it out to you. You find it echoing in yourself because you are nature." When a Sioux Indian would take the calumet, the pipe, he would hold up its stem to the sky so that the sun could take the first puff. And then he'd address the four directions always. In that frame of mind, when you're addressing yourself to the horizon, to the world that you're in, then you're in your place in the world, and that's a different way to live. So where does that transformation occur? We talked last class about transformation. What does it mean to have a sacred place, a place where the temporal walls can dissolve and reveal a wonder? Campbell says this is an absolute necessity for anybody today. And Buddhism sure as heck talks about this. You must have a room or a certain hour or so in a day where you don't know what was in the newspapers that morning. You don't know who your friends are. You don't know what you owe anybody. You don't know what anybody owes to you. This is a place where you can simply experience and bring forth what you are and what you might be. This is the place of creative incubation. At first, you may find that nothing happens there. But if you have a sacred place and use it, something eventually will happen. For earlier peoples, the whole world was a sacred place. But our life has become so economic and practical in its orientation that as you get older, the claims of the moment upon you are so great, you hardly know where the hell you are or what is intended. You're always doing something that's required of you. Where is your bliss station? The Indians addressed the buffalo as thou, an object of reverence. They addressed all life as thou, the trees, the stones, everything. You can address anything as thou. And if you do it, you can feel the change in your own psychology. The ego that sees a thou is not the same ego that sees an it. When you go to war with people, the problem of the newspapers is to turn those people, the enemy, into its. Sometimes the thou turns into an it, and you don't know what the relationship is anymore. The Indian relationship to animals is in contrast to our relationship to animals, where we see animals as a lower life form. In the Bible, we're told we're the masters. For hunting people, the animal is in many ways superior. A Pawnee Indian said, "In the beginning of all things, wisdom and knowledge were with the animal. For the one above, for Tirawa, did not speak directly to man. He sent certain animals to tell mankind that he showed himself through the best, and that from them and from the stars and the sun and the moon, man should learn." In the ancient caves, they painted the animals on the walls. They are so beautiful. Campbell visited one and he wrote, "You don't want to leave. Here you come into an enormous chamber like a cathedral with all these painted animals. The darkness is inconceivable. It's darker than any dark you have ever known. You don't know where you are. All orientation is gone. And you're in a darkness that never saw the sun. And they turn on the lights for you in the cave, and you see these gloriously painted animals. And they're painted with the vitality of a painting on silk in a Japanese painting. A bull that will be 20 feet long and painted so that its haunches will be represented by a swelling in the rock. They take account of the whole thing. They are temple caves. A temple is a landscape of the soul. And when you walk into a cathedral, you move into a world of spiritual images. It is the mother womb of your spiritual life, Mother Church. All the forms around you are significant of spiritual value. In the cathedral, the imagery is of anthropomorphic form. God and Jesus and the saints are all in human form. And in the caves, the images are in animal form. It doesn't make any difference. The form is secondary. The message is what's important. The message of the caves is of a relationship of time to the eternal powers that is somehow to be experienced in that place. So, the question, why am I here? We need to make something happen. I've talked about this in the last 3 classes this month. What it means to make something happen. This has been my business throughout my life as an actor. What an actor does is act. And that doesn't mean get up in front of people and say words. That's not my job. The playwright's job is the words. My job is the action. To make something actually happen in the room. So in the rituals of earlier times, right, these were the sanctified landscapes which affected you, which changed you. In them, something happened. The boys were taken from their mothers, and they were circumcised, and they were scarified. The men came at them with painted bodies and feathers glued to them with their own blood, carrying arrows and bull roarers, and they were brought to sacred places out of time. The women were taken to a hut for their initiation on the occasion of their first menstruation. This is what happens to a woman. Nature does it to her. She sits there and she contemplates, what is it to be a woman now? What is a woman? A vehicle of life. She's identical with the earth goddess in her powers, and she has to realize that in herself. The boys have to realize that they are no longer boys, that they are men, and they return to take a woman into their lives. We have the confirmation ritual. Let's say in the Catholic Church you choose a confirmed name, but instead of scarifying you and knocking your teeth out, the bishop gives you a smile and a slap on the cheek. And our rituals have been reduced to that, where very little happens to you. Campbell writes, when you see the old newsreels of the installation of the President of the United States, you see him wearing a top hat. President Wilson, even in his time, was wearing a top hat. He did not wear a top hat every day. But as a president, he has a ritual aspect to his presence. He says, now it's Johnny come lately walking in right off the golf course, you know, and sitting down and talking about whether or not you're going to drop an atom bomb. Even in the Roman Catholic Church, they've translated the Mass out of its ritual language, out of Latin, into a language that has a lot of domestic associations to you. The Latin of the Mass was a language that threw you out of the field of domesticity. For me, it's the King James Bible. To say, let there be light, is so different from turn on the lights. The altar was turned in the Catholic Church so that the priest's back was to you, and with him you addressed yourself outward. Now they've turned the altar around. Campbell says it looks like Julia Child, you know, giving a demonstration. It's all homey and cozy. And they play the guitar. They've forgotten that the function of ritual is to pitch you out, not to wrap you back in where you've been all the time. The rituals that once expressed an inner truth are now merely form. The Pope just stepped down. The highest archbishop in England just resigned. Many of the men who are now part of the conclave to choose a new pope have been accused of the same things. What is sacred? Where do we find what is sacred? Are our myth makers in this country the filmmakers of our time? I say absolutely not, because they don't hold the responsibility of a myth maker. The stories that are myths are making and breaking people's lives. They're there to take you through the most harrowing elements of your life, the most difficult moments that we all go through. Movies are made to make money. The kind of responsibility that goes into a priesthood with a ritual is not there. That's a problem for us. because we often see actors, directors, as the high priests of the land. So I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about the history of a break that occurred, because as I examined what had I brought with me from my upbringing as a Christian, was part of that what I was struggling with as I was becoming a teacher of Buddhism in my own mind as to where God is? In Christianity, we say that we are in relationship to God. God is out there somewhere apart from us, and we perhaps look up to God for guidance and inspiration and help. In Buddhism, they say that the mind is the equivalent of God, because where does God reside? Where do we know God? Where have we conceived of God? In the mind. And the mind can be taken to extraordinary levels. In this country where we have spent most of our time and money and efforts, we have developed the external technology that has gotten us quite far. But in India and Tibet, they were developing the technology of the mind for hundreds of thousands of years. And they weren't developing the idea that they were in relation to a God. They were developing the inner resources to deeply identify with God, to become one with God. And in fact, the Gnostic Christians and the mystics hold that to be the highest goal of their religion. So there's a very important line of differentiation between the traditions of the East and of the West. And you could draw that line at a certain point in time in the country that we used to call Persia. East of that line are two high culture civilizations, centers. There was India, maybe I should say this way, India, and the Far East, which included China, Southeast Asia, and Japan. They were civilizations in the sense that there was writing, there was art, there was civilization as in cities, as in groups of societies. West of that line are also two creative high culture centers, the Near East, or the Levant, as it is called, which includes Egypt, and then there's Europe. The two eastern domains are isolated from each other and everyone else. Right? India has the Himalayas to the north and the ocean, the coastline all around. China's isolated by the great deserts to the west and the ocean all around. New influences, therefore, have only come to these civilizations very gradually, and they've taken a long time to be assimilated into a culture that was already present. The European or Near Eastern domains, in contrast, were in immediate and constant contact with just about everyone. Right? There were arteries of transportation. There was the great Mediterranean. There were huge rivers like the Danube, like the Rhine. Historically, there were two important invading groups of peoples. In the north, there were nomadic hunting and fighting people, the Aryans. They came down into the European high culture domain from the grass plains of northern Europe. The other equally belligerent influence were the Semite tribes, who swept into the river plains of the Levant, the Near East, from what they call the Syro-Arabian desert. These invasions continually disturbed the existing cultural patterns. The Occident, the West, had a history of disintegration and reintegration. In other words, progress. When you've got a lot of people influencing each other, they're coming to collision, a great many ideas, and everyone has to fight it out. Maybe that sounds familiar. Campbell says that when one turns from the Eastern world with its complex philosophical and religious history, from the Western world with its complex philosophical and religious history, to the Eastern one, you have a sense of going to a place where the vegetation is all the same. You know, it's like it's all palm trees. There are different kind of palm trees, but it's all palm trees. There are a few essential themes that run through the whole system that have been there for a very long time. When did the high culture forms enter the domains of India and the Far East? Indian cultural tradition begins with the Indus Valley civilization around 2500 BC. The culture in the Far East begins in China with the Shang dynasty around 1600 BC. Both dates are within the Bronze Age. This is a long time ago. The development of high culture in the Near East, Mesopotamia and Egypt, started around 8000 BC with agriculture, with animal husbandry. And before that, people everywhere lived by foraging and hunting. By the 4th millennia BC, in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, those two mighty rivers, the Fertile Crescent they called it, you find relatively large, complicated cities like Sumer and Ur, Akkad. During this time, around 3500 BC, writing, mathematical calculation, astronomical observation, and tax collection were introduced. Kings arose, professions were created. The priests in these cultures recognized that the planets moved at mathematically calculable rates through the fixed stars, and this idea created a totally new notion of the universe: cosmic regularity. This notion rested on the idea that the cosmos is not ruled by a personal God. An impersonal power moves with irresistible regularity in the courses of the rise and fall of the day, the rising and setting of the sun and the moon, and the coming and going of the year. And this idea inspired the myths of the Bronze Age civilizations, and it is the basic idea of the Oriental philosophies to this day. The Chinese Tao, the Indian idea of Dharma, the Egyptian Ma'at, the Sumerian Me, are all images of an impersonal cosmic order within which the deities function as bureaucrats. These gods are not the controlling agencies. The controlling agency has no personality at all. They personify the forces of nature. These forces also operate in you, so that deity is something that is within you. The mythology of a people presents a grand poetic image and refers past itself to principles that are mysterious and ineffable. The four basic functions of myth: to open the mind of everybody in the society to that mystery dimension that cannot be analyzed or talked about, but can only be experienced as out there and in here all at once. That's pretty amazing. To me, that sounds like religion. 2, to present an image of the universe that connects the transcendent to the world of everyday experience. 3, to present a social order by which people will be coordinated to the mystery. The king was the center of radiating solar light. The king wore a crown that was representation of the sun or the moon. Look at the crown jewels. You know, if you go, through the Tower of London, you see the crown jewels, you are blinded by them. They are so gorgeous. The light, you literally can't look. The king's court was a kind of hierarchic charade. The counselors, the cabinet members wore the costumes of the cosmos. They circulated around the king like the planets. 4, to carry the individual through the stages of life, from childhood dependence to adult responsibility to old age and then through death. So the great cosmos, the individual, the order of society are all one great unit pointing to the dimension of the great mystery. This underlies Oriental beauty, its cities, its philosophy, its poetry, its music, its art. The fundamental thought, the mysterious ultimate truth, is absolutely beyond all definition. If you ask, is God merciful? Is God just? Is he loving? Does he love me? Does he love me and not those guys? Right? Is he mine? Am I chosen? Are the others rejected? This is kindergarten stuff from the Oriental or Asian point of view. The forms of sensibilities of time and space, all these are functions of human thought. And the mystery that you are seeking lies beyond human thought. And this is taken very seriously. The absolute is absolutely transcendent of all thought. It is beyond conception. In Western theology, the word transcendent is used to mean outside of the world. In the East, it means outside of thought. To imagine that your definitions of your God have anything to do with that ultimate mystery, to imagine that your definitions of your God have anything to do with that mystery is a form of sheer idolatry from an Asian point of view. But for us, your God is as good as my God, right? A God from this point of view is a reflex of your ability to conceive of a God. People have different powers of conceiving God. We don't even like to say God in our culture anymore. We'll say, you know, your God or whatever you want to call it. You know, we're so chicken. We so don't want to look at this or to face this. Teachers all over the map, you know, really, when they're talking to the public, are so terrified of stepping into this arena of so much fear and conflict and not wanting to look. So the fundamental theological thought in the West is that only God can know God. In Christianity, this is represented by the Trinity, where in order to know the Father, one must oneself be God. That's the role of Christ to fill. You are looking to know the Christ in order to break through into the Father, into God. In the East, that which is transcendent of all knowledge is the basis of your being. It is immanent within you. It is constantly being created by you. It is immanent. It is constantly becoming in you. This appears in the Upanishads as early as the 8th century BC, where they said, Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that, you are that. You yourself are that which you would know. But that you is not the you that you identify with now, here and now, this phenomenon in time and space that can be named and identified and described. Neti, neti, they say in Sanskrit. Not this, not this. Anything you name about yourself is not it. When you've erased all that you can name and you've broken through, then you've come to it. So, A is you, and X is the mystery, and in the East, A equals X. You are the mystery. The one you think you are is not it, and the one you can't even think about is it. And that's the mystery of the mystery. Now compare this with the traditions that have come out of the Near East, like Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Here, God was the creator of the world. Creator and created, creator and creature are not the same. To say, I am it, is a fundamental blasphemy. People have died for this. The mystic Sufi al-Hallaj and Christ were tortured on the cross, one for saying, I am it, and the other for saying, the Father and I are one. And they were not alone. So we are in exile. In the West, A can only achieve a relationship with X. Our religions seek a relationship to God, not an experience of identity with the divine. In Judaism, God has a covenant with certain people. How do you achieve membership in the group? I'm talking about on a formal basis, by being born to a Jewish mother and by honoring the covenant in your life. In Christianity, where Christ is true God and true man, in the East, this is the point everyone must realize about him or herself. But in Christianity, Christ is related to us through his humanity. He's like the center point, and he's related to God through his divinity. We become related to Christ through our baptism in his church, as in Judaism, through a social institution. In Islam, which is the youngest of these great religions, the relationship to Allah is through the law, the Quran, and through his prophet Muhammad. The Muslim faces east when he prays, not because that is where God is, but that's where Muhammad heard from God and received the law. Islam itself means submission, submission. not to something intrinsic in yourself, but to the law, the might of Allah and His law. So, to speak very broadly, in the Western traditions, the faithful are dependent upon social institutions, the chosen people, the Mother Church, and the law. And these institutions have, as Campbell would say, put forth pretty exorbitant claims about themselves. And we have a lot of difficulty with this. We have a lot of doubt and a lot of disequilibrium because of this. In the 19th century in this country, our own transcendentalist philosophers and writers began to realize that Buddhism and Hinduism were saying something that they began to open to. They gained the recognition of what was already stated in the Greek and Roman tradition where we see ourselves coming out of. The Romans were Aryans, the Greeks were, they were the cousins, basically, Greeks and Romans, of the Aryans. The Roman tradition and what is implicit in the Celtic mythology, Germanic mythology, these were based on the idea of a sacred grove, a sacred place, a sanctified landscape, a sacred object, but nature within and without. These traditions held that mythology was not an account of pseudo-historical facts that were supposed to have happened somewhere else a long time ago, but that the stories, the myths, are poetic revelations of a mystery which is now and forever and always within your own being. For the West, this was a possibility of an egoless return to a state of soul, which had been there before the birth of your individuality and will be there long after your individual sense of yourself has passed away. The first important stage of this, branching off, was seen in the Near East, where the earliest god kings and their courts had been ritually entombed. In Sumer, around 2300 BC, the king became no longer a god, but a servant of God, supervisor of the race of human slaves created to serve the god with toil. Not identity, but relationship was the paramount concern. Man had been made not to be a god, but to honor and serve him. The king who had earlier been the embodiment of divinity on earth was now but a priest offering sacrifice, not a god returning himself in sacrifice to himself. This was what the entombment was about. The king would take his queen and his entire court to death as an offering to himself as the divinity, as life coming out of death, so that the divinity would continue. The new mythology brought forth in due time a development away from earlier view of returning cycles. A progressive, temporally oriented mythology arose of a creation once and for all at the beginning of time, a subsequent fall, and a work of restoration still in progress. So we're leaving the idea that there are these cycles of existence, death and rebirth, the moon culture, the moon and the sun, the moon dying and being reborn, right? And moving toward, they say that this came about in Judaism, a sense of linear time. They say this was one of Judaism's gifts to the world, a sense of linear time. A progressive, temporally oriented mythology of creation, at the beginning of time, once and for all, a subsequent fall of man, and a work of restoration still in progress by man. The world was no longer to be known as a mere showing in time of the paradigms of eternity, but as a field, this is interesting, of unprecedented cosmic conflict between two powers, one light and one dark. Sorry, this is complicated to listen to, I know. Okay, so you moved from the Eastern idea of the identification with God as in yourself, out of time, undefinable, not nameable, ongoing, eternally present in you, right? You as the incubator of God, constantly being created, an eternally, constantly being created God. And you're moving now to a timeline where there was a creation, there was a fall, and man is looking to restore himself, to get himself out of a state of original sin. And now there arises a religion of the conflict between good and evil, between the powers of light and dark, between the devil and the angel, between God and Satan. And this was embodied in Zoroaster, who we really don't know when he lived. It says between 1200 BC and 550 BC. So we're kind of fishing around in there. But he created this religion where there was a God who represented all of the light, Ahura Mazda, and an evil principle, Angra Mainyu, who was the devil, out of which the mythology of Christianity eventually arose. Okay, so what I've basically been saying is that there was a time in the world, many, many hundreds of years ago, where the East and the West, really because of the exigencies of the cultures that they lived in, became arenas of different kinds of religious thought. So different that it's almost impossible to reconcile them. And this has been part of the journey that I've been talking about, that I've been trying to take. That when that first Christmas after I was studying Buddhism, I felt that tender connection to the Christ child in the manger. I'd grown up looking at him in his little crib on the mantelpiece in my bedroom. I felt compelled to call my Lama, my Buddhist Lama, Lama Marut, and say, what do I do with this now? Where do I put this now? And what I was expressing was the conflict. Am I in relationship to a God? Or is God immanent in me? All those things that I had felt as a young girl where I was communing with nature, was I communing with a sanctified land that was sanctified because of some reason other than my communing with it? Was my communion something that took place outside of me? Did anything happen to me? Why was I calling myself a Christian in the first place? Why was I calling myself a Buddhist? What on earth did that mean? And my sweet Lama said to me, don't worry about a thing. Because it's all the same. It's all the same. Okay. A creator God that is all-powerful is not the same as you containing a mind that is capable of godlike consciousness. That is not the same. To my mind, that is not the same. I can absolutely agree that it is a very beautiful idea in Christianity that suffering is redemptive. It has been my own experience in my life that suffering actually is redemptive. It's very, very tough, but it is redemptive. That it is probably the only platform of learning that we as humans have. Otherwise, we are all asleep. We're all just really going through in this kind of haze constantly in our lives, just reacting to things and then eventually looking at our watch and going, oh my God, it's 10 years later. But to me, suffering is a platform of learning deeply on a spiritual level. And usually it happens when there's absolutely no choice, when you're either going to lose your mind or you're going to go back to the garden, as they said in the 60s. You know, we've got to get back to the garden. You've got to go back to the place where the fall took place. And in a way, you've got to crawl back into the tree of all knowledge of good and evil. You've got to go back before that, before the split took place. Back to the Bronze Age, right? back to the sun and moon and the simple elements of time, because that is where we live. That is where we live. You know, in Indian mythology, they have the system of the chakras. The chakras being these extraordinary points in the body where they say this beautiful central channel, which is like the ultimate presence of unity of you and God, has running along with it these two side channels of your ignorant knowing, your ignorant misknowing, your ignorant desire, and your ignorant hatred. Those tools that we use in our lives to try to be happy, we try to bring the things close to us and grab them and hold on to them as tight as we can, that we love and that we enjoy, and we try to remove and shove away as hard as we can those things that we don't like. And they say that those tendencies are running in these side channels, and that the life energy, the divine force of all life, the great mystery, cannot penetrate throughout our entire being while these channels are wrapping around like a vine around this sense of identity with God, around our own Godhead. And as you move up these chakras, they say in the Indian system, you want to awaken what they call the Kundalini. The Kundalini is a feminine principle. It's this little girl snake curled at the bottom of the spine. Okay, we've got the angels and the snake. I can identify with both of those, even though it seems to me 99% of what goes on in religious life is male. I'm going to hang on to my angels and the Kundalini. In the ascent of the Kundalini, you go, through the first three chakras, which are, sexuality, the kind of what they call kind of groveling with absolute fact, thinking that the way that you think, what you think is true, is absolute fact, and acting accordingly, that is your world, that is what's true. So moving into, trying to acquire things, trying to gain power, fighting, war, struggle. This is the life in the lower chakras. So you finally rise up to the heart chakra where something starts to happen. They say it's like this beautiful image, of the Lama coming down or the divinity coming down and then the disciple rising up. They say it's like the disciple reaching up finally for something new and the Lama reaching down with the branches of the tree to grab the disciple by the arms at the heart chakra. They say as you move up, then you're going to cast away all of the ways that you have lived before, all of these lower ways of living. And you're going to turn towards looking for a new love with God, a union with God. And eventually you rise through the throat chakra, the chakra at the larynx, to the sixth chakra, which they say is the Ajna chakra right inside the forehead, where they say you have the third eye, the eye of inner sight, where you see a divine being manifest in your own image, a human God which transcends the human. So the erotic zeal that they say you have at this level of consciousness, the desire that they say is embodied with the wedding ring of a nun who is married to God, this erotic zeal has replaced the lower one between the legs, the Muladhara chakra, where your sexuality or earthly sexuality was. And the soul has found its proper love. This was the kind of love that was celebrated in the West by the troubadours and by those in the 13th century that created those incredibly beautiful cathedrals all over Europe, which was this love that will just burn itself up. It rejects the society. It rejects the orthodoxy. It doesn't give a damn what happens to it. It knows that the object of its love is the thing it wants to unify itself with. When Tristan and Isolde take the poison that was meant for King Mark, when Tristan was bringing Isolde to Mark, and they drink the poison by accident that was meant to make Mark fall in love with her. And they are consumed by love. The nurse that was accompanying her, the chaperone that was supposed to have been watching over her and missed the boat, says to Tristan, you're going to be damned to hell. And he says, if that means that I'm going to be damned to hell for this love of Isolde, I don't care. I will accept that. If I have to leave every form of happiness that this earth can offer, I accept that. This is this kind of love. This kind of love. They say, here within this body are the Ganges, are the Jumna. Here is Benares, here is the sun and the moon. Here within the body are all the sacred places, the seats of the gods and their approaches. I have not seen a place of pilgrimage or an abode of bliss comparable to my body. The Indian writers. And at the sixth chakra, at this Ajna chakra, everything is relationship. The relationship of I to thee, what they call in Christianity, the soul to the beloved. Here we behold the divine aim of all life, but it's as if there were a veil, like a little glass wall between us and the object that we love. And perfect love, they say, the perfect love that is embodied in the Eastern religions requires that there should be no wall. In the process of trying to come to terms with meditation in myself, I have had enormous resistance, because what always came up in me was a kind of dialogue, a kind of inner dialogue, either with self-denigration, this kind of chatter that would come up and say, what the hell do you think you're doing here? You know, the people who did this thousands of years ago and achieved all these things, you know, they had a right to those pretensions. They had a right to be, you know, going up into caves and spending years meditating. You're sitting here in the middle of Los Angeles, you know, or Massachusetts, you know, and you're about as materialistic as anybody that there ever was. And you think you're hot stuff, you went to Harvard and this and that. You are in so much trouble. What do you think you're doing? Right? And I would spend the hour like this. Or I might get connected to that girl that I was, who was writing in the Bible, you know, just gouging into those pages and exclamation marks and really in a conversation with my God. But I could not understand how we would become united. I was feeling my body, I had a sensation of my body, I felt I ended at my skin, and I couldn't totally understand how I was ever going to arrive there. So they say you have to move to the seventh chakra, to the crown chakra. You have to move from what they call the yoga of philosophy or discrimination. You have to begin to say, I am not my body. The knower of something is not the thing itself. And then the Indians, who always take everything to one more step, say, and the knower is not anything either. The knower does not have a kind of self-existence either. And then I began to understand what meditation might be for me. And that was silence and stillness. Silence and stillness and availability, just listening. If the best platform that I could meditate out of was I have everything to learn, then that was okay. And that was one of the first great, I felt, progresses that I made on my spiritual path, struggling with myself. It didn't come from anything that my Lama could give me. It came from how was I going to, I don't want to say, the best thing I can say is experience. How was I going to have some ineffable experience, not just chatter or a kind of begging and pleading for some God to join me on the path, on the journey. So Buddha says there is no subject of knowledge. The image of yourself can be removed. You are beyond all imaging. In Sanskrit, this is called jnana yoga, wisdom yoga. And there's another yoga, which is bhakti yoga. And this is where I sit now. This is truly where I sit now. This is the yoga of devotion and of ritual, but I would call it the yoga of participation. That, you know, I talked last time about transformation. I talked about the idea that Niels Bohr had introduced, the great Danish scientist who won the Nobel Peace Prize, that when you take two particles and you get them together, even if they are blown to the outer edges of the universe, thousands and thousands and thousands of miles apart from each other, if you influence one, the other is influenced simultaneously. That I thought, if I am thinking of myself as a self-existent self, which is very, very difficult to avoid, that I am thinking of my God that way. But I can think of us as two particles that are inseparable. And if I influence one, I influence the other. That if I find a kind of growth in myself by participation, and participation, they say, gives you the karma to become something. When, you know, we talked about this in last class, when Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita is on the floor of the chariot and he's crying, he's a mess, he's there with Lord Krishna, who he thinks is his childhood friend and charioteer, and they're sitting there in the no man's land between these two armies that are about to fight. And Arjuna can't bear it because his lamas, his parents, his cousins, his uncles, his aunts, his entire worldly family and spiritual family are in those armies about to open fire against each other. And he says to Krishna, what do? I don't know what to do. And by saying, I don't know what to do, and being willing to stay there in that mess, like me at the end of the road, the old Boston Post Road at the end of my run, bursting into tears, basically saying, how can I keep this with me as I leave here? How can I carry this and how can I become this? I don't know how. He gains the karma of devotion, of hanging in there. And they say that karma is so powerful, it will give you the eye to see God. And it gives him the karma, the wherewithal, the harmony that question brings. It's not a discord, it's a harmony. I don't know, because you've lost the identification of I know. You lost the identification of I'm so cool, how will I ever join with God? You know, God is, after all, only a little bit more powerful than I am. You dropped that idea, and you really don't know, and you're a mess. And hanging in there, which to me is meditation, in silence and confusion and boredom and, quote, nothing apparently there. It gives you the karma to say to Krishna, you know what? I have a hunch here that you're not just my childhood friend. I got this inkling that you're not just my charioteer. Who are you? And he makes the demand. He has this incredible strength all of a sudden. He demands, like Job. You know, like Job says, I'm a good person. You come here now, and you talk to me, and you tell me what you are. I can't go through any more of this. And then Krishna opens his mouth, and he looks in, and of course, you know, he backs off completely, and he says, okay, it's fine. Just, you know, drive me back to the other side, and let's go back to the way it was. But he has a glimpse, you see? He has a glimpse. then he has the karma, they say. They say there's a secret interpretation of the ending of the Bhagavad Gita. It isn't that war breaks out and all hell breaks out and everybody murders each other. When Arjuna looks again, everybody is gone. Everybody is gone. It was a war basically fought over land, and Krishna says to him, there is no land like that. There is no you like that. And all these things that you've been projecting, all the conflict in the world that you've been projecting, doesn't exist the way you thought either. Like the Orientals, the Asians said in their idea of divinity, you will not be connected up to your God. When you're a Buddha, they will not call you by your name. So where I am is in the floor of the chariot. I am in that struggle. I am in that pain. But I can say, standing here, notes from the perimeter at the edge of my experience, that it is worth being there. I don't know really how I know, other than by the good grace of my teachers, and also by the good grace of the people who surround me, including all of you that I teach and who teach me, that that is the best place to be. And for some reason, I feel a great happiness there and relaxation. And I don't feel that there's anything else that I need to be doing. And I wanted to tell you that. It's one of the reasons why I created these courses for myself, to try to understand my own experience and to tell you that, because I think that's incredible news. In Bhakti Yoga, in the participation, and when you participate with something in devotion, you are interchanging with it all the time. It's as if that cellophane wall, that glass wall, is just being interfered with all the time, is being permeated. The lowest form of religious love is that of servant and master. You know, just tell me what to do and I'll do it, right? The second is the love of friend to friend. God is your companion. You know, wherever I walk, there are two sets of footsteps. You think of him or her a lot, not simply in service a couple times a week or, you know, once every Sunday or Saturday. The love of a parent for their child is the third one, like the image in the creche, that the godlike child comes within your heart and you bring it close to you. You want to develop that, cultivate it, help it grow up in you. For the husband and wife, the devotion of the nun who's married to God, to Christ. Also, just the love of a husband and wife who love and care for each other, you know, above all odds, beyond all difficulty, and whatever goes down in that relationship, in that vow, they stay with each other. And 5, the illicit love, where there is nothing but love, and you're willing to lose everything. You're willing to bank everything on it. And I think this is what I mean by my experience now, that I don't care about other things at all, really. I don't care about other things. That love is a kind of supreme love. And somehow, through the number of years I've been studying this and working with my teachers and with all of you and helping to create this incredible place where we can all be on the floor of the chariot together. This is a heart that is not in control. And it's a heart that has abandoned the idea of trying to control itself. And this, I think, is the Buddhist concept of bodhicitta. This is what the Dalai Lama said in a beautiful teaching that I heard in Arizona. It was a Sunday, and it was the last teaching of a long weekend. And he said, you know, I will tell you something personal. I was in a 3-year retreat, and I was struggling very, very hard. And I prayed, tell me what to do. And he said the answer came, bodhicitta, this love, this great love, where you want to take everyone out of suffering, where you do not feel alone even when you are alone, where you want to bring everyone with you. And school can keep. That's all that you care about. That's all that you want. So I am no saint. I am no wise woman or man. But I am a teacher, and I feel there is a responsibility to being a teacher, and the responsibility is to tell you honestly what I know. And this I know with my whole being. So let's, if you want to ask questions, that would be fine.
I don't know how much this is a question, so much more of a comment. We talk about this unrelinquished type of love, this bodhicitta, and it brings up to me this flavor of my youth and seeing young people with their energy, with their music, with their I don't know willingness to try new adventures fearlessly.
Yeah.
You know? And it reminds me of me when I was younger too, and that I, you know, the world was my oyster. I could do whatever I wanted, and it was awesome. But there was a certain type of regret as well, because it was like an undisciplined kind of love as well. And sometimes I wonder what it would have been like for myself to have that passion with the wisdom that I have now at my age. What could have been, and so I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm getting a little confused by seeing this kind of bodhicitta that you're talking about, and this kind of fierce love with no boundaries. And to me, I kind of get scared with that idea that it's just like I've been there before, you know. And how do you harness that energy so that it just doesn't explode on you?
Yeah. My experience of it is that it is not like that. The description of it as, you know, out of control or whatever I was saying may make it sound like that it's a peaceful place. But it's directed. See, we have an idea sometimes of consciousness, you know, in the head, kind of directed like by the brain with this kind of fierce intensity. My experience of it is that there is an intent, definitely, but there's peace in it. And you know, I struggled for many years as someone who grew up, you know, with a lot of privilege and a good education, and a lot was expected of me actually in my family. And I tried to come through as hard as I could. And there are things that I have achieved in my life. But happiness didn't come in the wake of that. You know? And the things that I didn't achieve haunted me also, as someone who was meant to achieve the things I didn't achieve. And I have come to terms greatly with that idea of, boy, what I could have done if I'd known this then or whatever. But to me, that keeps you a prisoner of time in the worst way. In the worst way. If we can say that the only way that we've arrived here at this moment is because of all those things that we did and didn't do, then, you know, bless it. Bless your whole bloody life. And all that you didn't know, and all that you did know, and all that you didn't do, and all that you did do. All of it. Okay? The passion of a nun who's married to Christ is different from the passion of the lower chakras. The passion of the sixth chakra is different from the first 1, 2, 3, because it's above the heart. And, you know, I was talking in last class about the fact that you are loved, the Christian idea that you are loved. It's an idea that I adore. I don't think I'll ever be able to shake it. It's an idea that seems so true to me. And the idea in Buddhism that no one can appear lovable to you until you love them. means you have to be love before you can understand being loved. So the idea that you are already loved means to me that you can love, that you are made of passion in that sense, higher passion. You're made of it. You were ushered in by it. It's not some place where you have to reach, where you have to go. It doesn't mean there isn't a lot of work to be done. We have a lot of misunderstanding. You know, the more that I study and the more that I travel on this path, the more I want to be in retreat. I want to be in retreat just to give myself a chance to be quiet and listen. Something. As he says, you know, you practice and practice, something will happen. They say, you know, that you achieve a kind of mastery at anything, whether you're playing the piano or whatever. It's not the practice, it's not the mechanical moving of your fingers. That's kind of what we think it is. It's kind of an athletic achievement. You become more adept with your fingers. It's the karma of devotion. And I know this from being an actor. I know this even from learning accents, you know, to do in movies and plays. You know, you start out doing an accent, you're a complete idiot. You can't do any of it because it's a muscular change in your voice. And I remember my great, great voice teacher saying to me, just think it. Just think it. See? That's bhakti yoga. You keep coming back to the lesson. You keep coming back to the piano in spite of the fact that you cannot conceive of playing in Carnegie Hall. I was telling Rick the other night that I had worked with Dudley Moore, who had never studied the piano and became a concert pianist. And I said to him once, I said, I don't get it. I don't get it, Dudley. I would be so terrified to play. I was playing the piano in a movie, and I had created this little part that I played, and he was playing my imaginary friend. So we were with each other a lot. We were filming. And I said, it's so terrifying for me to play this little piece in the movie. How do you play in, you know, at Carnegie Hall? And he said, you can learn anything if you do it very, very slowly. That was one of the most comforting things I ever heard. Yeah, step by step, that's bhakti yoga. That's that participation. Eventually you're shredding that wall. You're just poking holes in it every time you sit down. And you don't even have to say to yourself, oh, I really know what I'm doing by doing this. You just sit down, you know. Or you, alone in a room, you place something on your little altar. There's nobody there. There's nobody watching. By that act, you have created a new reality. That's what I mean by poking holes in that wall, by that act. Whether it's my sitting this afternoon and going over what I would teach, that's poking holes in that wall. I feel less separated from all of you. Good question. That's a really good question. Anybody else? Yes.
You reminded me that in the past, and even in the present, I've kind of done religion based upon just in case. Just kind of a devotion to a God, just in case. That I'll find that it was true and I needed to do it.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to get your another reflection from you in terms of the feel of the God within as compared to that God.
Yeah. You know, they have a whole genre of literature in Buddhism called the Lam Rim, the steps on the path, the steps to enlightenment. And one of the lower levels, they say, of spiritual awareness, they say, you know, basically those people are just afraid of what's going to happen to them after they die, and so they're motivated by that. It's not a bad motivation at all, okay? It's like the joke about the Manna was dying, and they brought the priest, and the priest looked down at him and he said, do you renounce the devil and all your works? And the man looked up at him and said, right now I'd rather not make any enemies. I think,
Woody Allen said, was it Annie Hall, right? I don't believe in the afterlife. I'm going to bring a change on the
Yeah, I mean, you got to start somewhere, right? You got to start somewhere. And it's a perfectly good place to start. But it's not bhakti yoga until it is, until you're really participating. And what I've discovered is you don't have to know something to participate. You don't have to have suddenly had an epiphany to be devoted. In a way, I think looking for the epiphany first is just a way of holding it off, just keeping it at arm's length, like saying, it's like the idea of perfection. If we're all aiming at perfection, well, we don't consider the word perfection as having anything to do with us. So how are we ever going to get up close and personal with perfection? It's just a moving horizon. It's just a way to feel bad about ourselves. We don't need to feel perfect in order to participate in some kind of devotion. We need to live for something higher than ourselves. In my opinion, it creates a really happy life.
What's comforting in it is that if you can posit it, if it's coming from you, instead of struggling out there, you're getting in touch with the highest part of you. And that's something you can have devotion in, that there's a part of you that's seeing it. And that might be the thing within you that becomes it, because it's there. You can see it otherwise. You couldn't fathom it or hold it. It's you. It's the best part of you.
Yeah.
It's easier to devote to that and to
Yes.
then be giving from that.
Yeah.
Feels like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They say that the best way to pray is not to say, oh, please give me this and that. That's not really a prayer. But give me the strength to help everyone have this and that. Help me to have the insight to help everyone have all that we need. That's a prayer. They say that can happen. And when you pray that way, something happens to you because it's not the norm.
Embarrass you.
Oh, Lord.
That's such a in a nice way.
Thank
One
you.
of my favorite pictures of Lindsay is this thing about what's acting and what's bhakti. And so there's a picture of Lindsay, and you got to be like maybe 3.5 or 4. And she's got a whole nurse's suit on with a little hat and the whole costume. And she's got this little baby doll she's taking care of. And it's that thing about getting in touch with that. And it's such a part of her now that I saw, oh yeah, it's this very interesting direct connection that can act out in different ways. But first you put on the costume maybe
Yeah.
a little bit and do it, even when you're 3 years old.
Yeah.
It's my favorite picture. It's my altar picture, if I confess.
That's so sweet.
Because that's a bodhisattva.
But the costume is really important. I mean, acting is just this extraordinary profession for understanding spirituality because I just don't believe in belief. You know that you can't believe that you're a character. You can't believe you're your own mother or father and you're very close to them. You can't believe anything. Belief is the result of an act repeated over and over again. And then you string those acts together and that creates a kind of faith or belief. I prefer to call it confidence. But nothing will happen without you arriving first on the scene. You got to arise first on the scene. There's a kind of activation that has to happen because without activation, nothing will happen. And to me, spirituality is happening. Religion takes place in happening. When you give something to someone, Let's say you haven't been giving people on the street money because you think they're, going to drink themselves to death or whatever, and you decide one day, well, on a spiritual level, giving is good because it creates abundance. You can't give unless you have. Interdependent with giving is having. So it makes you rich. St. Paul said you're just sending it on before you. It's going to come back to you. You can be sure of that. On a secular level, if you give, you've lost. But in the moment that you do the experiment with absolutely, no Carnegie Hall in front of you, no heaven opening its gates before you, but you make that act of giving to someone that you have never given to before, that's religion. In the happening of that is religion. And they say you can't find any element of that in Buddhism. They say it's all empty. It's like you are not self-existent, and the other person isn't self-existent, and the act itself isn't self-existent. It's all like this flow, and that's a permeable situation. That's a moving, changing, alive situation. And when you're participating in that, you are alive. You are really alive. And then when you go to sleep that night, you're not thinking, oh, well, another day down the drain. You are more alive. And, they say in every religion, every of the world's great religions, all of them say, the only way to be happy is to be for another, is to live your life for another, not looking out for number one as the primary concern. And that's why it's relaxing, the kind of passion I'm talking about, why it's relaxing, because you know what to do. You're not looking for another profession or another town to go to or another guy or another girl, whatever. I used to cry when I heard the geese fly overhead when I was young. And I was sitting in a psychiatrist's office once, and the geese flew overhead, and I was in a real crisis in my life, and I started to cry, and the psychiatrist said, "Why are you crying?" I said, "Because the geese know what to do, and I don't." But now I know what to do. All right. It's getting cold in here, and we have food to eat, things. Are there any questions, Mark, from the outside world? Is the outside world there? That's what Buddha says too. Chicken. All right. Let's dedicate this teaching. Yes. Oh, Dimitri.
You mentioned how there's a difference between spirituality in East and West.
Speak louder. Sorry.
You said there's a difference in approach to spirituality in Eastern and Western traditions.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned Lama was saying it's the same.
Yeah.
And we keep hearing it's different, and then it's the same.
Yeah.
Is it that the Western traditions, they kind of came out of Eastern traditions? Is there some kind of adaptation which is really the same? I mean, is there an essential difference? Is there an actual difference? Or is it just...
What I'm saying is that there was a deep philosophical split that you can sort of get a bird's eye view of and look at in history, all that blah, blah, blah that I was saying about all those civilizations, etc. But what we're talking about ultimately is we're looking at ourselves when we're talking about that. That in the beginning of trying to have a spiritual path, we don't feel qualified. We see all these amazing pictures of deities or of God or whatever, and we're down here and we think we're going to try and relate to this in some way. We're going to try and take on some aspects of this. Right? And then ultimately, just like with Christ and with Al-Halaj, we want to be like the moth and the flame, and we want to unite with what we see as the ultimate good. So that's how Lama Marut says they're the same. That's how he says they're the same. Is if you look at it with those eyes, that anything that we're thinking about, talking about, doing is coming from us, including this thing right here that you all wrote tonight, they would say, that the idea of a split is the split in us, that's all. That we first have to be in relation to a God of some kind. And then as we get more and more confidence from these acts of faith that we do, we get more and more confidence that perhaps we are loved, which means we are love, which means it's possible for us. We do the work of God. We don't need to think so much about the identification. We continue to do the work of God, and the identification arises. This is how you create a character in a play. You perform the actions of the character. The character doesn't exist anywhere. The character is a figment of your imagination, the playwright's imagination, and the audience's imagination. It hangs in the air somewhere, and there's probably a separate character for everyone in the room. But you decide what the actions are that the character takes. And then the character appears. And, you know, I've spoken about this before, that some of the most extraordinary moments of my life have been when I prepared correctly and worked really hard, and one night, this voice is coming out of my mouth, you know, after all the hours with a voice coach, it's coming out of my mouth. My body's moving the way I thought this person would move, and it's happening naturally. And it's just proceeding, and I don't feel as if I did anything to make that happen that night. I feel like I'm, you know, a hollow tube or something, that this is coming through, like music or something through a horn. And when I go out to take the applause that night, I just feel very lucky to have been there with everybody else when that was happening. And everybody in the room knows that something extraordinary has happened. Everyone in the room knows. You've probably all been at performances like that, where it's just unmistakable.
Is everybody in the room feeling a shade of what's happening? I'm always struck by the idea that we have this individual karma, and yet you get in one of these social gatherings, like a theater or something, and something happens like that, and it's true, you feel it everywhere in the room. But there must be some sort of communal karma happening.
Sure, sure. Of course. That is shared karma. I mean, I'll tell you from my point of view as a teacher and as a student of Buddhism personally, the idea of everyone having their own karma confuses me. I can certainly say that, sure, you can see everyone as having their own karma. But if I do that personally, then I let myself off the hook. I'd rather be taking personal responsibility for it, or trying to train myself to say that, you know, when you're stepping out on stage, the first moment you just feel like you got hit with wet newspaper. You never felt so awkward, or, you know, like you feel like you can't do anything normal. You can't pick up this cup, it'll fall out of your hand or something. By the time that you perform for a while, you start to feel at home. And even though you know that there's all these separate people out there, and they're all maybe dressed up, and it's opening night or something very scary, if you really take personal responsibility for the whole situation, okay, I set myself up to be here in this scary performing situation, but what the hell am I doing here? I'm speaking for someone who's mute. I'm a purveyor of myth. I'm now going to try and strike at the heart and get everybody off of that wheel of, you know, half-dazed existence, sort of barely being here and responding to just the noise and the day and whatever. We're going to have an extraordinary experience here, all of us. And I'm going to start. I'm the one who's going to start. Then you feel that it's just one field of energy. Just one field of energy. And the truth is the truth. The truth, you know, one particle and another particle, the truth just resonates throughout the universe when you're present with the truth. The truth is one. think that's what we're saying.
So we all are sort of each opening a portal to the same truth.
Yes, exactly.
Reality.
Yes. Yes.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And it's a safe place to do it. They say that theater is a safe place to do the things that aren't safe to do elsewhere. So it can be a very radical and wonderful place to raise consciousness of the whole. That's when it's most exciting. Yeah. Like hair. Just like hair. Exactly. Now you understand everything. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I know a lot about God and the soul, but I'm just curious as to, I'm not a Buddhist, what is the Buddhist definition of God?
Right. I think the Buddha would say that the mind is the equivalent of God, of the concept of God, because it's in your mind that you conceive of God. And when you are moving on a spiritual path, it's your mind that's opening to more and more possibility of being like God. And eventually, as they say in the mystic traditions, becoming God.
So there's a God in Buddhism?
There are deities in Buddhism. There are deities in Buddhism. There are aspects of the psyche, your psyche and God's psyche. They say they're aspects of the divine. But I would say the main thing that is held as a divine being is the mind. The mind, your mind. Pardon? Oh, that's very well spoken. Yeah, the mind is ineffable. The mind can't be weighed or photographed or, right? The mind is an extraordinary, non-local phenomenon, like God. And it's interesting.
Description of God. What is the description of God? Right? We keep using the term God.
Right.
Christian God, Muslim God, Buddhist God.
Right.
What is this God?
There is no Buddhist God like that. There is no description like that. Like a creator God?
I'm just trying to clarify the God.
Yeah.
That's what we're coming on.
Yeah, Buddhism would not posit an eternal, unchanging, all-powerful God. Buddha posits a Buddha who is omniscient, they say, who knows all times and all places, but is not all-powerful because when you have an all-powerful God, you have to come to terms with why there is suffering. If God is all-powerful, why is there suffering? So in Buddhism, God is not all-powerful in the sense that the mind is not all-powerful, but the mind can achieve omniscience, supreme knowing, they say, supreme consciousness. That's really, you should come here. You should teach. you should be up here. Yeah, really, who is there to know is very, very interesting. This is very, very advanced question.
Well, because we use God, I grew up educated by the Jesuits, so I'm used to God.
What would you say?
New definition of God.
Yeah.
Do we have a new one?
Yeah.
We have a new bhakti God, or I'm just curious.
Mm.
The term is used a lot, so I just
Yeah.
one with it. There is a God that we can all, it's basically whatever that is, it's beyond our own comprehension. Right?
Yeah.
It's the term we use, I guess.
Yeah. I think that that's correct. In Buddhism, they would say that God, that the experience of unity with the divine is the deep understanding that there is no self-nature to anything. Everything is interdependent. There's no self-nature to anything. And that would be that permanent, fixed idea of God. They would say, for them, that is not what Buddha means. But that there is an all-knowing mind So that the mind that we have now can be opened, and it can be changed, and it can be taught, and it can discover, and it can, I want to say achieve, but I don't like the word necessarily. It can know more than it knows now. It can be more aware of its true existence. But these are great questions, and
Well, that's why I said I have some fun. I mean, asking someone what God is. I mean, if you were able to do that, you'd probably be able to wave a wand over all of our heads and be the all-powerful God, right? So
yeah, yeah.
just
Be interesting to ask the Jesuits.
oh no, we have.
Yeah, what they would.
Really amazing, you know, it's beyond experience.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Use a word to describe it.
yeah. They say that omniscience means that all times are collapsed, no past, no present, no future. It's all. that's a creation of the human realm. Time, the ticking of the clock, the aging of the human body. They say that is this concept, this idea. It's not self-existent in itself. There is no actual time. It's there's 9 billion calendars. There's 9 billion million ways of telling time. There isn't time like that. So once there isn't time, who are you? I don't think I can tell you right now, but as soon as I know, give me your number.
Well, that's the thing. We have a friend who's a quantum. He's a physicist, and that's
Yeah, yeah,
says we say that all these things are all happening now
yeah, exactly.
simultaneously.
Yeah,
The time is this strange other dimension.
yeah. The physicists, I think, are really humbled by what they are working with. Really humbled, and I think they feel, they understand what this unknowable entity is, perhaps better even than we do. They are in the presence of this amazement all the time at how things are functioning, how things are working.
And it just, this guy said, some of these theories, they can't be proved.
Yeah.
Theoretically, we understand them.
Yeah.
And now these theorists have become like ancient mystics.
Yeah.
We just
Yeah.
have to accept
Yeah.
because, we think we can make it make sense.
Yeah, yeah. We can't put it in a box. Our box is too small. Yeah.
I think, though, what I can apply to time is kind of analytical. I can look at time like I can look at anything else, and I can't find any self-standing aspect of time, or the concept of it, because time has parts too. And if I start taking apart the moments of time, I find that there's no beginning, middle, or end to the beginning, middle, or end, and now we're back down the rabbit hole again. So it exists like everything else does, where there's not that unindivisible particle of whatever I think we're able to find.
I mean, I think the important thing about this whole conversation, even this class tonight, is we have this human life, and certainly anyone who is in this room wants to make good use of it. We have a sense that we might not be able to make good use of it and be at a point where we were conscious of dying and be really wretched, really miserable at that moment. We're trying to avoid that, right? We're trying to avoid a really lousy outcome of this incredible, incredible opportunity that we have of being alive. In my mind, it doesn't matter, Occident, Orient, what God we worship or what ideas we hold of what is sacred, so long as we challenge ourselves to make meaning of our life and to be in the world as a part of what is good, and be happy during the time that we're here, and help others in order to be happy. That's really all this whole exercise is about anytime we meet together here. And we're all trying to do that. Yeah. Joseph Campbell, who I quoted a lot tonight, was a devout Catholic. as a young man. And he said that he got his sense of what is sacred from the Catholic Church. And, he was describing the old days, where the priest turned around and not understanding the Latin and all of that. He said he felt the presence of the mystery. His very favorite place was Chartres Cathedral. And he said one of the high moments of his life, he was in Chartres, and the caretaker of Chartres came over to him because he was visiting there a lot. He was studying in France. And the caretaker came over to him and he said, "Would you like to ring the bells today?" In Chartres, they ring the bell at the transition of day and night. And so he took him up this little staircase, and there was a kind of a seesaw. And Joseph got on one side, and the caretaker got on the other side, and the caretaker, gave a kind of kick, and off they went, up and down like this. And every time they did, they heard below them this huge bell ringing, bong, bong, the hours of the day. And Joseph, my hair stands up even just thinking about that experience. When Joseph came down to thank him, he asked him, where do you live? And the man took him to, down the nave, across the transcript, into the apse, where there was a choir screen. And the man opened a little door in the choir screen and went through, and he had a little bed, a little table, and a lamp. And lying in his bed, he was looking up at the figure of the Black Madonna and this huge, beautiful window. And Joseph thought, I'm really in the presence of, this is the real thing, this is the real experience. And, he said, that's the real bhakti yoga. This man is living this. So, these are great, What would we know? Yes. Buddhism does have some things to say about it, but I think it would be better not to talk about them now because we'll be here all night and next day. But thank you all so much. So let's dedicate the good merit of teaching. And they say when you dedicate it, you give it away. The only way to have something is to give it away. So we don't want to leave here thinking that we're so cool. We just want to give that away too. So, because we have been here tonight thinking about the biggest things we can think about, because we have been devoted, may we offer this up, our merit, and you may offer to the whole, or you may offer to something that you need or want that would help you to be of service to the whole. Go ahead, just quietly. Thank you for the honor of teaching you.
Please teach around.
Thank you. When a teacher says that to you, they really mean it, because, I could have sat around, watching the game this afternoon or something. I could have done anything else, and I was thinking about this and thinking about you, and because you were going to be here, I did that. So it's an incredible impetus for all of us that you come and are so sincere. So I really do thank you.